We acknowledge that this event is taking place upon the traditional territories, the territories of the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy, the Anishinaabe peoples of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and before them the Chinantan Nation, called the Neutral by the French, and the Attawandaron by the surrounding nations. These people are the original caretakers, the peoples that lived on and intimately worked with these lands. We acknowledge that we have a responsibility to know and understand their heritage. The treaty that was signed for this territory is the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 of 1792, and further the deed referred to as the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, which applies to the land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from the mouth to its source. We need to be aware of our role in these documents. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples upon this land. We acknowledge that we have an obligation to learn to live wisely together on this land.
So initially, just to give you an overview, and I've really focused on Brant County, the city of Brant County. So we look at the rail lines that went through. So the Buffalo Brantford Goddard Railway, this rail line here, the Great Northern Railway that missed Brantford up here. Then they did a connecting line to the Great Northern, and ultimately they put the main line through Brantford, so it went like this instead of like this. There was a line that went to Tillsonburg that came down here. And then we had some electric railway lines. We had a line to Hamilton that operated over here. Along the river and down to Port Dover, we had the Lake Erie Northern Railway, and between Waterford, Brantford, and Hamilton to Welland in this area here, we have the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway. There we go. So initially, there were roads, well, the trails, really. There were just Haudenosaunee trails, these just the natives that lived in the area. So the other way you got around is following the trails. The trails ultimately over time developed into a lot of the highways that we use today. So I'll show you a map of some of the original trails, and they have become the highways. What is interesting to know is that the trails, the native trails, all took the highland because they never then had to worry about flooding or bad weather, losing like the swamps. They would just avoid the swamps. Whereas when it started to become settled, and the colonial government just started drawing straight lines everywhere, there was a lot of problems where they put roads in where they had problems because in low-lying areas you get swampy conditions and the whole bit. So some of the roads, some of the early roads avoided all that. The early trails. So this Highway 2 and 53. That trail has existed for hundreds of years, and in the early 1800s is one of the first trails that the government fortified. That is, they built what they call a log road. What do they call it? Corduroy road. Thank you. A corduroy road, because what they needed to do, it was for troop movements to get troops inland from Hamilton, from the Hamilton area. And if you look at when they built the road, roughly the first bridge over the Grand River occurred around that time, so occurred in the 1810, 1812 time frame, where they actually built a road so the troops could move across the river. Other roads they built, what they call the Grand River Trail, which is Highway 54, the highway to Galt. So East River Road is still there. The highway, when they started developing the highway, went on the west side. Highway 24A was over here, and then Highway 24 goes up here, but you can see the original trail. The Long Point Trail, which is largely the old Highway 24 that went down into Waterford. Then you had a road that went from Burford to Victoria. There's really nothing much left of that particular road. Why were railways important? You couldn't move very well. You couldn't move your manufacturing goods. You couldn't move stuff into the area, or produce, or lumber, or flour from your grains out of the area. So it allowed the settlers to not only get in here, but to expand the markets. It also, initially in southwestern Ontario, it provided a shortcut between Buffalo and Michigan. It's much faster to cut across southern Ontario, even today, where the highways, most Americans going between the two will take the 403 and the Queen E, then go below Lake Erie. So it was meant to be a shortcut. There's a number of things that happened initially. So first, there was no money. Money was very, very scarce. Hence, that's why the Grand River Navigation Company was largely built with funds, trust funds from the Haudenosaunee, because they had the largest pool of money in Upper Canada at the time. In fact, they had a larger pool of money than the government actually had at that time. So there just wasn't a lot of money. Building railways, so it's the cart before the horse, like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? You got to build a railway in order to develop the interior of the province. Otherwise, you stay along the coast. But there's nothing in the interior. So you have to invest a lot of money to build a railway, but then it takes a while to get the money back, because you need to get people there, and you need to clear the land, you need to develop the land and move it out. And the colonial government really didn't have a lot of money. And a colonial government, by this time, the idea wasn't to take money from England necessarily, like government money, and invest in Ontario. You set up a colony so that you can exploit the resources of the colonial area and get that back to the home country. That's what they were trying to do. So initially, there is quite a few dollars that have to come over this side to get things started. But by this point here, the Crown in England wasn't, or the government in England wasn't really that interested in putting a whole bunch of money in, at least government money in. So in order to get the railways built, in Ontario especially, and well in Canada, it was rather, railway development here is relatively late compared to the United States, where they started in the 1830s. Here it was almost the 1850s before we got anything going. And the three key acts that were passed was the Plank Road Act. So that allowed companies, if you will, just individuals or investors to build a road. Initially, instead of chartering a road or a railway, you could create one under the Plank Road Act. So the Brantford-Buffalo-Goderich Railway was actually first incorporated or organized under the Plank Road Act. You won't find a lot of data about the early days of the Buffalo-Brantford-Goderich Railway because there is no legislation, there's no statute. It wasn't chartered right away. It was chartered a number of years later. And then excursions got to be very popular because the road network wasn't very good. If you wanted to take a lot of people, really weren't buses you could take, but on a train you could take hundreds of people to any of these places. So you just charter a train or charter a bunch of cars. You go for the day and you come back. I showed you the map of the railways that were in Brant County. This shows you what happened in the city of Brantford. So this line here coming through into this area was originally the Brantford and Harrisburg Railway. That was a railway line that connected Brantford to the Great Western Railway, because remember the Great Western Railway bypassed Brantford. This line here is the Brantford-Buffalo-Goderich Railway, the first railway in town. The line that basically goes from here out to Tillsonburg is the Brantford, Norfolk, and Port Burwell Railway. And this other line you see here is the Toronto, Hamilton, Buffalo Railway, the light blue one, and the dark blue one is the Brantford, Hamilton Electric Railway. And lastly, this one here is the Lake Erie and Northern Railway. So you can see that by the 20th century, early 20th century, there was a very good network of railways that developed within the city. And if you start looking, like you can start, all these places here are all commercial, they're all factories. So you wanted to be near a rail line. It was important so that you could have loading facilities. You didn't have to start moving your goods to the railway station. In the early days you had to. But if you look at some of the early development in Brantford, it happened up along the rail line up here, because that's where it was. it didn't come into town proper until the 1870s. So the Brantford Buffalo Gardens Railway, it was the third railway in Ontario that chartered in Ontario. So there was the Toronto Simcoe Lake Huron Railway, there was a Great Western Railway, and then there was the Brantford Buffalo Gardens Railway. Why do we have a railway going through Brantford? Because the Great Western Railway decided not to come through Brantford, they bypassed Brantford. Why did they bypass Brantford? Well, the story goes that Brantford wouldn't pay them a bonus, so they didn't bother to come through Brantford. And railways, like money was hard to come by, and railways needed any help they could in order to finance the construction of the railway. So with Brantford not providing a bonus to the railway to come through town, that was a strike against Brantford. But on the other side, what you had is it was a developing manufacturing center. And so the original line went through Harrisburg and Paris. Well, there is nothing in Harrisburg. There never was anything in Harrisburg. And Paris was still small. So from a revenue generating point of view, it is kind of like biting your nose to spite your face, because now you don't generate any sort of revenue to move goods out of Brantford, manufacture goods, and move raw materials into Brantford. And another reason would be that McNabb and his partner, they owned land on the north side of the Dundas Valley. So Brantford actually would have made sense to put the railway through from Hamilton, because Highway 2 and 53 goes from Hamilton to Brantford, so they would just kind of follow that line. And if you come up the Niagara Escarpment on the south side, it's actually easier to do it. It's more problematic on the north side, but the McNabb and other principals, they had land on the north side of the valley that they wanted to develop, so they routed the railway through that land. If you've taken the railway and you've taken Via and you've gone through Coketown, you always know when you go through Coketown, because the train slows right down. It probably goes 30 miles an hour. And that's because the ground there isn't solid. It's like a sinkhole in that area. So they have to keep over time, like filling it in. So it was just a really bad place to put a railway. But that's what they did in the 1850s, and we still live with it today. So that's why, if you notice, if you go from Brantford to Hamilton, it's not that far, but you slow down in two places. You slow down at Fairchild's Creek, because it's kind of, the land over the creek isn't very solid as much as if St. Pylan's down. And if you get a really heavy train and you really look, the bridge kind of bounces a little bit. So you have to slow down for that bridge. And then a little bit further down the line, you get to Coketown, you have to slow down again. And then once you get through Coketown, you speed up a little bit, then you hit the junction at Bayview, and then you have to slow down again, because there's Ys, and you're either going to Hamilton or you're going to Toronto. It finally steamed into town in January 1854. So if you live in Ava Heights in Brantford, and you don't like the train going by your house and making all that noise, it's been there since 1854. Okay. When they built the railway, they put the workshops in Brantford, so that's where they would build, service all the engines. The engines weren't built in Brantford, but they serviced it here. And then also the rail cars, you'd have to do work on the wheels and just maintain the cars. That was done in Brantford also. The railway started up in January, shops burned to the ground in May. Total, which is those shops burning down is ultimately what hastened the demise of the Grand River Navigation Company, because the money that the city was going to give to the Grand River Navigation Company to help them fix up their locks and to get them in better shape got diverted to the railway, because the railway was the future, and it employed more people, because it was people in Brantford that it employed. The company, as most railways were at the beginning, was not very well capitalized. So trestles were poor, line was unballasted, there were labor problems, you get those first three, and people don't use the railway because they don't want to get involved in a fight, they don't want to die, they just... So the fall of 18, so about 18 months later, they shut it down because there's no money. Finally, it gets taken over by some investment money from Liverpool over in England. They rename it the Buffalo and Lake Huron Railway, and they reopened the line about a year later. So it was closed for a year. In that time, they really had to rebuild the whole line and get it up to shape. It struggled. So the Brantford Buffalo Railway was a good idea if you realize that the Grand River Navigation Company took you from Brantford to Buffalo. That's where the Brantford trade was initially. You could take a boat to Buffalo in a day, 24 hours. Remember I said you get to Hamilton, it used to take 7 hours. So you could take a boat, and that was really smooth. Like, it was great, and the service was really, really good. You could get supplies sent into Brantford, so Brantford pottery, they got their clay from New Jersey, so that went through the Erie Canal system and came up the Grand River Navigation Company. But of course, it's waterway, and it closes down in the wintertime. So, but the railway's open all year round. What the railway was designed to do was to undermine, if you will, or capitalize on the fact that trade had already developed through the Grand River Navigation Company, and they would leverage that trade, and they would just slowly move it over to the railways. But it just, the trade wasn't that good. That is, that the railway just kept, because of all the setbacks, it was poorly built, money was hard to get, the shops burned down, they had to build them again. Brantford was still, so you're looking at, the 1850s, 3,000 people, maybe, and it was early manufacturing, but still, it just wasn't a lot of people in this area. It struggled, it chugged along, and finally, in 1864, they struck a deal with the Grand Trunk Railway to help them manage the railway. And what they were really hoping for is more than a management, is them for ultimately to take over the company. So a lot of early railways and a lot of communities, and you'll see this later on, when they wanted to build a railway to their community or divert one, the idea was raise some money locally, get it started, and then hope to sell out, because that's, even today, tech companies do that. They put out an app, they get people to use it, and then Microsoft or Google pays them $1 billion for it. So they'd love $1 billion, but the whole idea was if you got the railway established and you got some traffic moving on it, no matter how well it was built, the line was there, then the big guys, which in those days was the Great Western Railway and the Grand Trunk Railway, would come in, and then it would be an area they could service, and they would just fix it up.
Question.
Yes.
Now, why was Godrich picked as the other end? Was that
because what they wanted to do, it wasn't a great place either, because it's a really poor harbor there.
Yeah.
It wasn't very good at all. But the idea was, so there was no St. Lawrence Seaway. Right? So everything went to Buffalo, and then went through the Erie Canal. So Buffalo was behind this railway because they wanted to maintain their importance as a port city. Everything from the Midwest ultimately went to the Great Lakes and Chicago and Gary and different places in Michigan, then all went to Buffalo. And then in those days, everything had to be, because there was no containerization, everything had to be transshipped. So off the boats, on the dock, and then you put it on the barges that went through Buffalo. So the idea of going to Godrich is you would shorten the distance. You wouldn't have to come all the way down Lake Huron through Lake St. Clair across Lake Erie. You would cut across. And as they were growing wheat, especially in the American West, it started in the Canadian West too. So it made a lot of sense, is to have a port there. It's just that the port was always problematic because it was never deep, and they always had to be dredging it because it would always fill in. But that's why they picked Godrich. Then a couple other things just in note is that they finally built a bridge over between Fort Erie and Buffalo. The bridge still exists, it's still there, they still use it. So now the trains could go, you didn't have to stop it and get in on the ferries. And of course, they provided passenger train service. And interesting is that they ran the passenger trains till 1960 between Stratford and Buffalo. This was the line. Just a shortcut, basically, from Lake Huron to Buffalo. The reason I put this in here, Great Western and Grand Trunk, is in the very early days, so in the 1850s, 1860s, they sort of had like a gentleman's agreement to say this from Hamilton to down here to both Sarnia, this was Great Western territory. And this was Grand Trunk territory. And they wouldn't compete with each other. Because why would you? Because then all you're going to do is drive the prices down. So you're trying to establish rail service and you're trying to get the lines built. So it's to your advantage to have a monopoly in an area as long as you possibly can. So the conundrum was when the Brantford, Buffalo, Goderich, or the Buffalo and Lake Huron line started running into financial problems, the first thing they did is they went to Great Western and says, do you want to get involved? And Great Western said no. Because it was in their territory. They said no. So they went to Grand Trunk, and Grand Trunk thought, well, hell yeah, because, you know, they get into their territory. So ultimately, that's how the Grand Trunk got, that's why they took the railway over. The Buffalo and Lake Huron Station. So by this time, well, it's not for the, you know, it's Grand Trunk now, but I'm just referring to it as this. This was the second station built in Brantford. This station was a brick station built in 1881. The very first station built in 1854 was a frame building. They were all frame buildings because it was cheap and easy and you didn't know what was going to happen, so they're all frame buildings. I can't find a decent picture of it. I mean, I find a picture, but it doesn't, poor contrast, you don't see anything. This one isn't great either, it's pixelated. But nonetheless, this is the, you know, they finally built a more of a sturdy brick station. So I'm going to take you down the line a little bit between Brantford and out to the county. So Canesville actually had a stop. It wasn't really a station per se. It was a platform with a little shelter. So you could get on or off there or take the train from Brantford to Canesville. Onondaga Station. So this particular station, this was the second station, so I'm surprised I found a picture at all. I don't even know where I dug it up. But it's a very poor picture, but it's the only thing, you know, that I have. And you can see that, you know, it hasn't been around for like an awful long time. And if you go there today, I mean, there's a C and Onondaga sign there, but there's nothing. There's no foundations. There's nothing left of it. And then further to the east is Middleport, just a little bit down. So it was very similar to what they had in Canesville, just basically a little stop for passengers. So you can see on this one that they weren't really handling freight or anything on these smaller ones here.
So can I ask another question?
Yeah.
As the train made its way along that line,
Yeah.
how would it know there were people ahead waiting for it, or did they just stop at every?
They weren't going that fast.
Okay.
The workshops, so the ones that burned down. So if they're right across from Yates Castle. That's where the workshops. Where it is it's the sorting yard that the CNR uses as a sorting yard. I'll show you some pictures of what it used to look like. It was Brantford's largest employer. At its peak, it had about 350 people, and mostly it didn't have men working at the shops. I mean, it was crummy work, right? It was very heavy, it was dirty, it was a foundry, it was metal castings a whole bit, but they had a lot of people there. The shops closed in 1897. Why did the shops close in 1897? Again, I'm going to get into this, but what happened was, for a while, Brantford was a GTR town. That was it. The only railway that went through town was the Grand Trunk, because what we'll find out is that the Grand Trunk not only took over the Buffalo-Brantford-Goderich Railway, but it took over the Great Western Railway. So now all the rail service was operated by the Grand Trunk Railway in Brantford. industrialists in town. I mean, it was to their advantage to have competition, so they wanted to encourage railways. So ultimately, where Brantford supported the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway to come to town, the Grand Trunk Railway said, if you do that, those shops go. And Brantford said, we're doing it. And they said, so are we. And they moved the shops to London. That's how we lost that. So that was a big blow when we lost the shops. They sat idle for a while. Brant and Letchworth, which is a Buffalo and Rochester-based foundry in the States, they took over the property because they had a large, they were getting a larger and larger Canadian business, and they couldn't service everything out of Buffalo. They just weren't big enough out of Buffalo. Plus, you had the tariffs and everything that you had to worry about. So it was to their advantage to set it up here. So Brant and Letchworth then took over the plant, set it up, and they manufactured for the railways. And if you were here last month when we did the Ukrainian immigrant project, this with Brant and Letchworth, there's a bunch of youths from Buffalo that came to Brantford, about 50 families, and that kind of established the Brantford Ukrainian community. It was through this company here. In 1912, Canada Car and Foundry bought them. They were a Montreal-based company, and then in 1952, they closed the shops down, and then they tore them all down. If you understand how Sydenham Street goes, so Sydenham's at the top of the hill, and then it goes down the side, right? They changed the name, something like it's that, and they blocked it off. But when I was a kid,
you can't go down
you
it
could.
anymore. Yeah.
And then what it did is it went straight across the railway, and then it comes out of Pearl Street. That's what it did. Well, as the shops were expanding, it was not convenient for them to have the road, a public road, go through, like to keep crossing the public road, because it wasn't through their property, of course, but they had their buildings on both sides of the road, so they petitioned the city, and then the city ultimately closed Sydenham Street. That's why it's not continuous all the way from Pearl Street to West Street, because of the workshops. And as you will see in this build, there is one building. So okay, I'll show you. So the Prince of Wales Royal Tour in 1860, his car here, was built in the Brantford, or rather the Buffalo and Lake Huron shops in Brantford. It was the forerunner to the Pullman cars. So rumor has it, I don't know, I've read different things, I keep digging and digging and digging, I can't sometimes connect all the dots. It was commonly assumed that George Pullman was in Brantford, he saw the car, had the idea, and he did something with it. We can't be certain of that, because a lot of ideas are coincident ideas. Like people all over have the same idea. The telephone was that way. Bell just got to the office first, but I mean, it was happening, a number of people were all doing this same development at the same time. So it is hard to say, but this was the first opulent rail car that was built in North America. This is what the works looked like. So Canada Car and Foundry, they of course expanded a little bit, but you can see how big it was, and it was a foundry, and then they made castings and parts for rail cars, metal parts for rail cars. This is Sydenham Street here. And it cuts across the area there. And this here is the pattern shop, which still exists on Esther Street. That building is still there today. On the Great Western line that went through, Harrisburg and Paris, train service started on that line in November of '53, and it reached, and then it hit Paris in December of 1853. So Paris, in December of 1853, got the Great Western Railway that took you to Hamilton and then to Niagara Falls, and then later on that year finished off to Woodstock. And then a few months later, in April of 1854, the Brantford Buffalo Goddard with Paris. So this little town of Paris, a few thousand people, had two railways in 1854, when there were hardly any railways in Ontario. The early railways were built to what they called provincial gauge. So these the distance between the rails was 5 feet 6 inches in Ontario originally. Now, the story goes that that was legislated. And then in 2017, I forget the name, Brian, there's a fellow who did some research and he found that the 5'6" gauge was never legislated. There was never any mention of the gauge size in any legislation that was designed to regulate railways. In some railways, it got into the charter, as it was added as part of the charter, but it wasn't legislation that did it. It was the Railway Commission that did it. So everywhere in North America, it was 4 feet 8.5 inches. And in England, it was 4 feet 8.5 inches. But not here. So why is that? Because John Poor, who was an American from Portland, Maine, his idea was he wanted to build a railway from Portland to Montreal and then into the American Midwest. And he wanted a different gauge so that he could monopolize the traffic from source to destination. And he didn't have to worry about interchanging with anybody else. So that was his grand idea. So the Grand Trunk Railway, which was an offshoot of his railway because it was the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railway in the States and the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railway in Canada, built between Montreal and Portland. Those railways were 5'6", and then as they extended the line, the Grand Trunk line, the Grand Trunk line through Ontario into the Midwestern states, they maintained the 5'6". So that's what Great Western adopted because it was in the area. Well, it was a shortcut railway, right? We're going to go from Michigan to Buffalo. Okay, except when you hit the border, you had to unload all the boxcars, then you had to unload all the boxcars and take it to Buffalo, and you had to do the very same thing, right? So there's a lot of transshipment done. That employed a lot of people. It's just what people used to do. That's what they did. So finally, they thought, well, this is silly, right? So the thought, we got to install the third rail. It took them a while to install the third rail because in some of those charters, they mentioned the 5'6". So they had to, the government didn't really care. They just had to go and get the charter revised. That's all to change it so that they could win. And they installed the third rail. So for the longest time, you can see where the Great Western started to install. So you had 3 rails. So you could put the American cars, just keep them going, and then you had the Canadian cars. Harrisburg, interesting place. Really crummy place to try to do anything. They thought it was going to be like the metropolis of southern Ontario, but there's no water there. So it isn't good for railways either, because steam railways need water. So it was just a really crummy place to put a line. But it's there because, remember I said Brantford wouldn't pay a bonus to have the Great Western come through Brantford? Well, Galt said they would pay a bonus. So what they did is the Great Western wasn't going to go up to Galt because the whole idea was to get to Windsor and to Sarnia. But they said, but tell you what, we'll build a branch line. And they decided that Harrisburg is where, and so that's why Harrisburg came to be, because it was the point where the line went to Galt to take advantage of the $50,000 bonus that the town was going to pay the railway. So Harrisburg had a bunch of names. You can see a whole pile of names. And it was finally named after the president of the Great Western Railway, Robert Harris. If you go back through certain materials, you will find these names, but they're in very, very short periods of time. So because there wasn't really much there. So Grumman was a family that lived in that area, and so was Carsters. So like a lot of it was just based on who was there, and there wasn't a lot of people there. What was where Harrisburg even became more important was so the Buffalo and Lake Huron line went to Paris, but they didn't join. So I'll try to picture, it's just, they just crossed, there's the diamond crossing. So if you wanted to ship and then like change, what did you have to do? You had to unload the boxcars, and you had to load it back up again. The reason why they didn't put any interchange traffic initially is because they didn't want to help the other company. It was just a matter of, I'll keep my business, you keep your business. If you want to cross the tracks, fine. When they built the tracks across in Stratford, actually, which is not in the county, they did go through quite a battle of the Navy's ripping up the one, putting down theirs, and the next day they'd rip them out and put them back down. So you had those types of things until they said, we could just put like a diamond crossing and solve that problem. So even though you could take the Great Western to Paris to get to Toronto, because that was the only way from Brantford you get to Toronto, unless you took the road to Hamilton and took a boat to Toronto, because the boat was way easier and faster and way smoother. People didn't want to do that because it was kind of, I don't know why we do this, but I'm going east, but I got to go west to go east. Airlines do it to us all the time, but it's just, we don't like that. So we wanted something a bit closer. So we finally agreed, the city finally agreed to pay a bonus to the Great Western Railway if they built a line connecting Harrisburg to Brantford. And that opened in 1871. And the train station that they used was, it was on Coburn Street between Clarence and Echo Street. So remember the Pioneer Station with the funny roof on it? That's where the station was, just in and behind that. That's where the original station was. And the railway ended there, and that's what Brantford wanted. They did extend it, and I'll show you later. So because it was an important railway for what later came in Harrisburg. But of course, there's no traffic. Like Harrisburg isn't. Harrisburg just a pain, for the railway. I mean, they built it there, but there's no business there. But they had all these junctions and interchanges. One to go to Galt and one to go to Brantford. It was a very confined area. It was tough to move trains in that area. So over time, they diverted. Brantford went to the Grand Trunk Railway and they said, we'd really like to have the line come through here. The Grand Trunk said, we'd really like to go through Brantford because there's a ton of business in Brantford that we're not getting. So you have to remember that, this is important, okay? Because Brantford wanted the railway, right? You're going to see another slider happen. And then the railway wanted to come to Brantford, right? Just keep that in mind. But they finally diverted the line, and I'll show you some maps what the diversions look like. Well, once they diverted the line, there was really no point in going to nothing in Harrisburg, 150 people there. You could go to Paris, but you would get to Paris through Brantford. What was interesting when they built the line is that line that comes through Brantford is actually 5 miles longer. I think it's 5.4 miles longer. And that's not what railways usually do. They try to find a shorter path, not a longer path. However, there was just a lot of traffic in Brantford, a lot of everything in Brantford. So, amazingly, they provided passenger service to St. George to 1959. And then it's just, you can see like there's rail lines up left, right, and center. They've gone by the wayside, but you can see some of the dates that the lines were removed from service. So, the original Great Western Line like this here. And in 1871, they built this line here. This was the Brantford and Harrisburg Railway. Then in 1905, they added from Alfred Junction, which there's nothing in Alfred Junction. There never was anything in Alfred Junction, but the railway's name, all junctions, give a name. Anytime there's an exit, there's a name for it. So this was opened up in 1905. As the trains started coming down through here, they did send a couple trains, passenger trains a day through here, or there used to be maybe 8 or 10 through here. They sent a couple through here, and that slowly went by the wayside because you're kind of doing Harrisburg and St. George. I mean, there's really, even then there wasn't much. And the St. George station isn't in St. George. It's a couple miles south of the town, of the village of St. George. So then what happened is, as this became the mainline traffic, we just discontinued this piece here. And then they decided that they weren't going to do any more rail traffic through anymore. They were going to always just use the main line through here. And there is a bridge over the Grand River up here. So if you go on East River Road, you'll see the pillars of it. Well, so they discontinued the train service in 1932, and then when World War II happened, they took the bridge apart and used it for scrap metal into the war effort. So that's why there's nothing there. They finally abandoned the rail line to St. George in 1962. So what happened was, while these funny abandonments, well, what really kept the railways going, a lot of these small centers, and I showed you that one of the Great Western, where it went up into Kincardine and up into in Huron County and Bruce County. What really kept those lines viable is what they call the rail post office. So not every train, but there was at least a train a day that had the post office on it. That's how you got your mail. And it was actually pretty efficient because they'd load it up in Brantford and they would start sorting on the train. So by the time they got to Hamilton, they'd say, well, here's the Hamilton stuff, and then when the next place, and if Hamilton was going to go down to St. Catharines, and they would just dump it off there. So mail was continuously being handled, but in very small batches, not these huge big factories that they have now, where the automated stuff was always on the move. Well, as the roads improved, they started to move to trucks. And it was the mail trucks, the Royal Mail trucks ultimately, that put the rail post offices out of business. Without the rail post office, it wasn't worth running the train anymore, because that almost single-handedly covered the cost of running the train there. So that's why you see around that 1960 period, a lot of this stuff starts to go by the wayside. For these, and that's what happened. St. George used to get their mail up to 1960 by the rail post office. And the line was abandoned beyond St. George. So what they would do, they would pull in, stop, unload, pull back up. That's what they did. Station in Harrisburg. So in its heyday, if you will, before the line got routed, it was a big station. It was a pretty crummy station, and the food wasn't very good, and people hated it there, and it wasn't well lit, and it wasn't always manned. And if you came from Brantford, that's where you had to get off, and they supposedly were coordinating the schedules between the Brantford Harrisburg and then the Great Western line, but in spite of all their best efforts, it didn't always work out very well. So a lot of people spent a lot more time here than they really wanted to. If you've been through Harrisburg, so this picture, you'll never see this again. I remember when I was younger, I remember this. So what would happen is, this is the main street. So as you go across the bridge, you ultimately go out of town and hit up Highway 5. And you come in the back way, and then you hit German School Road, you go to St. George, right, or Highway. So when they built the railway through, they dug it out to keep the tracks level. That's why that's why they have this. It wasn't a natural valley, they dug this out. When they got rid of the railway and they ripped up everything, they still had the bridge. And that just cost money to maintain. So they filled it all in. So you won't see, you can see nothing of it. You won't see that contour of the land or anything like that. The bridge was kind of cool because it kind of went like this and like this. It was, it looked rickety, but it's made of wood. Mm-hmm. And wood is really strong. People think wood is really strong, right? And of course, when they built stuff years ago, it was overbuilt, and it was all virgin wood, and it was bigger than it needed to be. So it wasn't going anywhere. Over time it would rot, but it was still well-built bridge. St. George Bridge. So as you left Harrisburg on the Great Western Line going to Paris, you went over this bridge. So if you take County Road 13 from Highway 99 into St. George, you go north into St. George, you will see remnants of the pillars, of the piers that are still there. So it is, and if you look on either side as you go down there, the land is higher on both sides. So they had a number of bridges that they built there. I didn't include the picture of the 1889 train wreck because everybody's seen it. So I just thought that. And if you haven't, you look it up, it's easy to find. It's everywhere. This was the St. George station. So originally in St. George, when they built, they had a station there. There was no loading facilities, but there was some manufacturing facilities in the flour mill in St. George. So what you had to do was take everything to Harrisburg. 20 years later, they put loading facilities. It's just that if you see where the station was, at the top of the hill, there's a driveway, and it's not very wide, and it's quite an incline. I'm not sure it'd be that much easier to load in St. George than to go to Harrisburg, where it's a bit flatter, and get your stuff to Harrisburg. But they did put it in there, and you can see some of the loading docks here. And then they replaced. Oh yeah.
Is that building still there?
No.
No.
Everything's gone. And then they replaced the building I just showed you with this one in 1947. And then when they closed everything down, everything got. There's a house there now. It was built in the 60s. As you went to Paris, I found this out, it's really cool. There's a little, and I'll show you a map of where this is. Dumfries Siding Station. So do you know where Blue Lake is? Blue Lake Road, okay. So there was the Portland Cement Company was there. The Ontario Portland Cement Company used to mine the marl from the lake. And the Great Western went just south of Blue Lake. And this station was at the junction of the line going into the Portland Cement Factory. So it's just a little shanty in it. There was a fellow there, he was there like 40 years. And it was really, I mean, people could get on and off, because if you worked there, you could use it if you wanted to. But it was really for mail. The mail would just get dropped off there. And then your mail would just get. So, the Great Western Line, which then became the Grand Trunk, right? Because the Grand Trunk bought the Great Western in 1882. The Ontario Provincial Portland Company. So this was the spur of the line that just went up and loaded. The Paris station. This was the second Paris station. The first one was the Frames station. What happened to it?
It's not there.
Exactly. So they built this one here. This one kind of looks like the Brantford station, right? I mean, not quite as often, but it was, what they did. So a year later, they built it in bricks. Now they had a bit of money, and they wanted more permanents because stuff was burning down all the time. So they started building more into brick. So this station, of course, on the Great Western Line, went through Paris, and then went past Blue Lake and into St. George, Harrisburg, and on to Toronto that way. So this was for Paris, this was the train station. You look at a map of Paris, and you look at the way the railway goes through Paris. Okay, there's what they call Paris Junction, or Paris Station, and then there's Paris proper. So the train station in Paris was always quite a ways from Paris itself, as Paris was developing. But of course, the rail line here was right at the edge of Brantford when they built it. I mean, you build it at the edge of town or way out because there's nobody there. You know, land is cheaper. You don't have to worry about things. You can do it. And then over time, it grows over. So in Paris, it was the same thing. Plus, it was on a straight line for it. And it always bugged Paris to have to go that far away. You know, the roads weren't great. It was far to walk, and you would have to take a taxi or some sort of carriage to get to the train station.
Is this the one by St. James's Cemetery?
No.
Okay, this is on the other side of Paris.
This is, yeah. It's just
Right
below
there.
Spruce Street, and Market and Spruce, that area there. This is a junction so this is the Brantford Buffalo Goderich, and this was the Great Western. This was not a connecting track. It was just used for other purposes. So the lines did not connect. These lines were 5 foot 6 inch gauge, not 4 foot 8.5 inch gauge. The important thing I mentioned about the Brantford-Harrisburg Railway is this point here. It opened up Cockshutt Flats to industry. So prior to that, you just had the railway running along just up here on Durham Street. right? I think that's where the railway runs at the edge of town. This finally brought the railway in. So when I showed you that early map of the line, that pink line coming down, we would get into Cocksmith Flats. And there's a picture of Cocksmith Flats. Okay, there's the Market Street Bridge. There's downtown Brantford. So what did you have? You know, you had Scarf Paints here. You had the Hartley Foundry here at one time. You had the Mini Radiator here. You had Massey Harris here. You had Coring Watrous in this area. So it really opened up this what they called the Brantford's first industrial basin. That's what the Brantford and Harrisburg Railroad did, because then it allowed you to have sidings into this area. Now the station was here, but they just put sidings in here. This was the Brantford, Norfolk, and Port Burwell Railway. And when they built it initially, it stopped in West Brant. And then they finally built it, and it was a separate railway. It was a privately financed Brantford Railway. And it was one of those railways that was built so that they could sell it off to somebody. So when the Great Western bought it, then they just joined it all up so you could get from Brantford, from the main line into Tillsonburg. Burford Station, so this is when you're going to Tillsonburg. It was a nice station. So it was 54 is when they ended passenger service on the line, and then the stations don't survive primarily for one reason, is that if you have a building on a property, you have to pay taxes on it. So if you burn it down or tear it down or move it, your taxes go way down. And the railways are not, a benevolent society. They're not a heritage society, right? They're trying to make money. So that's really the biggest problem that we deal with trying to keep it. Station in Harley. Interesting, it was originally named Derby. Hatchley Station, which you're getting closer to, you're in Burford Township, so you're getting closer to Norwich. Okay, the Grand Trunk Railway, finally. What's interesting about the Grand Trunk Railway, so we see the rail line, we see the subway at Clarence Street, Rawdon Street, Murray Street, okay, they didn't exist. It was all level crossings when it was the Brantford Buffalo Goddard Railway. When they diverted the line through Brantford, and of course Rawdon and Murray are not, but they raised the whole line. So that's when all those subways and the raised tracks appeared, okay, was in the 1900 to 1905 time is when they raised everything to go through Brantford.
Yeah, because these newer airlines, yes, railroad lines were coming along and intersecting with established railroad lines. What would the procedure have been? They approach one another and say, I want to cross your tracks and we'll build an intersection? Or that you have to build a bridge?
No, it depends how busy they were. And, if it was a really busy line, then they would look to, build an overpass or a subway. If it wasn't, as you got in the southwestern Ontario places, more of it was just level because there wasn't enough trains to worry about. And they would put a tower and they would have somebody there so they would control it. But it got really busy, so your Great Western, your Grand Trunk, the main lines, you have so many trains going through there, you really need, you want to avoid it as best as you can. Remember I told you how the Brantford really wanted the Grand Trunk Railway and the Grand Trunk Railway really come to Brantford? Okay, so they did. They came down from Elford Junction into Brantford. They joined with the Buffalo Brantford Goddard Railway just to the east of the Brantford Railway Station. And then they went out. Well, when the main line came through here, the traffic just increased dramatically. I mean, that was a really, really busy rail line. Tons and tons of trains. It was a problem, okay? The railway, as you left the station, was all level crossings. Across St. Paul Ave was a level crossing. What's on the north side of the railway tracks on St. Paul Ave? A hospital. Right. Couldn't get to the hospital because the trains were there. They'd stop, they'd be shunting, they'd be busy, right? You'd always have to wait. So Brantford, wanted the Grand Trunk kind of Brantford, so they did. They came to Brantford. Then they said, oh, well, you're blocking the route to the hospital. You pay for the subway. So they said, well, we're not doing that. So it took them 5 years. In 1915 they started, and then they kind of sawed off, and we both did, something, and they finally put the underpass. So the underpass we go through every day, or a lot many of you do, which was built in '76 and just rebuilt. It was actually opened in 1921. And then the one with the train station was opened in 1930 because that was flat as well. And again, it was just because of traffic. This is interesting here. The cutoff, the railway cutoff. The railway cutoff is Highway 403. So the 403 is there because what the railway wanted to do is they wanted to take the freight traffic and go as from the east end of town across the town. So when you look at the 1930s, there was a township, but there's hardly any development in what we call the North End in Brantford. And then passengers would come into town. But this way it would get the city off their back, they wouldn't have all the traffic going through Brantford. It was the Depression era project, so they would start the project. So they started it. So they started excavating. They started, because they had to lower it and keep the grade. And they would be doing all their work, and they'd be digging, and then they'd come the next day and they'd be full of water. So they drain the water, and then they do on their work, and then they go away and they come back and they'd be full of water. Well, the water table is really high there in the springs in that area. So they finally gave up on it. They owned it. They owned that piece of land. And if you recall, if you're old, most of you will know that, but I remember because I lived near it, like Kingsford Road. There was a bridge over nothing. I mean, there was just kind of two of the. It wasn't railway tracks. It was just looked like two dirt roads. But that was the railway right away, and it was all along there. So the Brantford Township approached the Ministry of Transportation and said, "Why don't you buy the land so that we can route the traffic, Highway 2 and 53, north of the city instead of taking it through the city?" Because in the 1950s and 1940s, Coburn Street was just awful to get through. It was busy. And it was a main highway. And people just hated it. All truck traffic, everything flowed between Hamilton and London, flowed right through downtown Brantford. So they wanted a way to bypass Brantford. So what they finally did is they tendered it out. It was done by, I think, Dufferin Construction out of Toronto built the line. It was a big joke in the construction trades in Brantford because they didn't know that, the water table, but they did. They knew exactly what they were doing, they knew exactly what they were getting into, and they basically put tiles and there's a big sewer pipe underneath it that drains everything away. So when you're driving over that part of the 403, you're driving over big drainage pipes so that you could get the highway through there. But they didn't have that ability in the 1930s to do that, to put the rail line through there. You asked me about the train station. So I showed you what the old one looked like in 1881, and this is where it is today. Obviously, right? Because they didn't move it. So what they did is they built it next to it. The railway tracks were over here, and they just tore this building out and built the tracks. Paris Station. Front and back. You don't see this very often. This is a street side view, but it's a pretty cool building. By building the station and putting the tracks through and raising and everything like that, that's where Broadway Street used to go all the way through to the hospital, and then they closed it. And what they did is they put John Avenue Bridge over. So where the bridge used to be on this side, on this side, they moved it way over here, connected it with John Avenue. And it's Paris Junction is what I wanted to show you. So this is the line that went to Brantford. Okay, but it was a junction, and all junctions, busy junctions, had towers. So in Paris they did have this tower. And then when they discontinued the line and the traffic diminished going to Harrisburg, they ultimately didn't need the tower, so they just cut it in half. They just dropped it down. Excuse me. What you have here, this is a line to Brantford. This is a line to Stratford. This was the Brantford Buffalo Goddard line. And this line here is the line that it was abandoned in 1981. So if you remember going to the Paris Fair back in the 70s, if you went past the fairground, there's a bridge over the railway tracks. Well then, when they took the line out, they just took the bridge out. Toronto, Hampton, Buffalo Railway. This is what ultimately broke the Grand Trunk's monopoly in Brantford, by having this line come to Brantford. This was a real industrial workhorse railway. They serviced Hamilton, they serviced Brantford, they connected Brantford to Waterford, where the Canada Southern line was, which was the Michigan Central, New York Central railway line. So just moving traffic out west, that was a good way to go. They were a real workhorse railway in Brantford. And again, what they did is they took over the Buffalo, Brantford, Waterloo, Lake Erie Railway company, and that was just to build to Waterford, to break the monopoly of the Grand Trunk Railway, and hope like hell that somebody buys it. And I know it's odd because it's called Toronto, Hamilton, Buffalo, but it went from Waterford to Welland. So what had happened was they decided, instead of building a rail line here, they worked Canadian Pacific, which owned the railway, which bought the Toronto, Hamilton, Buffalo Railway. They worked to deal with Grand Trunk Railway to get rights on the tracks, and then Grand Trunk said, well, then we don't have a competing line building right next to us. We'll make some money, it'd be better. So they did go to Toronto through this line here. So the Toronto, Hamilton, Buffalo Railway first started operating between Waterford and Brantford because that was the first piece of track that was opened. Went through a number of owners, and then when it finally got taken over by Canadian Pacific Railway, it had money. And it wasn't just Canadian Pacific, it was New York Central, Michigan Central, and Canada Southern. So there was a lot of money into that little railway, important railway in Brantford. The original THB station, the first one that was built, was this one here. And then what they did is they doubled the size of it. So they added this front portion on, because that's how busy the passenger traffic got to be in Brantford.
The left picture looks flooded.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It was just the only picture I could find that just showed the single building. It was very, very hard to find, so you take what you can get.
Or is it located near the river? Or?
No.
Okay.
Cockship flats flooded all the time.
Oh, all right.
All the time. It was just crazy. And they started in the 1890s. I don't know why they built down there, but they started. The industrialists were saying, "Well, this is really, it floods all the time. What are you going to do, city of Brantford? Well, you built it, didn't you?" So they started that whole dike work that we see in Brantford started in the 1890s. So about, I think 1895, 97 is when they started building the dike walls in for the Cockship Flats and for Eagle Place. And they didn't finish it until 1977, so it took a long time to build the dikes through town here. What was also important, so we talked about the Cockship Flats that was served by the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo, and by the Brantford and Harrisburg Railway, but also this was the Massey Complex, the Verity Plow Works in Eagle Place, and this was the rail line. So with the THB, that opened up that whole Eagle Place area to industrial development as well. And that's why you had the industries moving and building there in the turn of the century, because you had reliable rail service. Little station in Mount Pleasant, Scotland, none of these are left. The line ended in '86 because there was the bank along Coburn Street collapsed. Took it out. CP looked at it. They're only running a train, the Stelco Works in Nanacoke. So what they were doing is sharing the business between the CN and the CP. It just wasn't worth it for them to put the money back into the railway and rebuild it and open it up. The sad thing too was in the early 80s, about 83, 84, because it was doing the train, or the shuttling between Hamilton and the Nanacoke Works, they rebuilt the whole line. Like if you would have walked the trails early on before they put the base on it, it was all slag that they used for ballast. And so it was just an excellent line. It was really good rails and everything about it, and then within a few years it washed out, and that was the end of it. So now we're entering into the early 20th century, and we get into the inner urban lines, or the electric railway lines. So what was good about electric? Well, they were clean, they were light, they were easy to build. That is, you didn't need the roadbed didn't have to be built to such a high standard. You could have a steeper grade, so like when they came up from Brantford to through Ancaster, it was a steeper grade than you would put on a steam railway, especially if you're moving freight. It was, because it was electric, you only need, you could run a lot more service on it. That is, that the frequency of service could be much higher. So Brantford to Hamilton was an hourly service. You could get to Brantford every hour by train on the Brantford-Hamilton line. What happened, so they really got, interurban started in the 1890s, and they really proliferated in the early 20th century. They peaked around the 1920s, 1921. They were really popular, but then you had a number of things happening. One is that automobile ownership started to increase. All right, so people didn't want to be reliant on the rails. Okay, then you had the roads got better. They were starting to pave the roads, and even if they didn't pave them, they macadamized them, or they just graded them. They were just better roads. And then finally you had the Depression, and then again there's no money, and nobody was moving. But what the so you had interurbans and you had local railways. So what I think is interesting, so Brantford Street Railway, and if you're familiar with Kitchener-Waterloo, they have Line Express, they have a street railway. In the 1930s, they had a street railway, and we took it all apart. And then 80 years later, they spend like $2 billion and basically rebuild the whole thing all over again. The first railway was organized here, the street railway, in 1879, and absolutely nothing happened with it. So in 93, the charter was bought by a fellow from Toronto, and in 86, it was bought by a fellow from Cornwall, rather, and got service established. There were horse-drawn carriages. It was really crummy service because the trains would derail all the time, and then there'd be always ruts between the rails where the horses would go. So it wasn't great, but it was a way to, it was mass transit. Finally, in 93, Fred Nichols bought it, and with some partners, and they electrified it. So then you got rid of the horses, you got better cars, you got heavier cars, and then they started offering service all throughout the city. So you didn't have buses, you had rail service. In fact, the first and then what was popular in the 1890s and early 1900s is railway companies would set up parks. They would buy land, either have amusement parks or just picnic parks, or places to take people. Because the whole idea is you had to pay a nickel to go from downtown to Mohawk Park, right? But it was traffic, and it was a way to build business. So Mohawk Park started that way. It was land leased by the railway, or by the street railway, to be a recreational place for Brantford. They had canoes and places you go in Mohawk Lake. They had a racetrack there, and picnic facilities. It really was, up until the Second World War, quite a little hot spot in a hive of activity. A company called Von Ecke Company bought it in 1902. It was an American. He had grandiose plans. He basically wanted to go right down to Windsor, and he had a line in Ingersoll and Woodstock, so he wanted to expand, because this was the rage at the time, interurban railways. Okay, so the Von Ecke had both the Brantford Street Railway, and it also would start another railway that I'll show you about here. The street railway did run into trouble, so the Von Ecke Company ran out of money, basically. It shut down for a few months. And then it was litigation with the city because it was a private company, but they were providing a much needed service to the community, because the community was expanding. Ultimately, the municipality took it over, and they ran streetcar service in Brantford until 1940. The first bus was introduced on Terrace Hill, so they sent it from downtown to Terrace Hill in 1916. Every other place in town was serviced by the Street Railway. They tried to run a pilot program, and so they discontinued streetcar service for a while in 1932, and they ran buses. People didn't like it. They said, no, we don't want to do that. So they went back to streetcars. But in 1936, they decided, you know what, we're going to go to buses, because that bus is the future. That's where everything's going. So that's what we're going to do. They ran into a big problem when they finally did the cutover. Okay, so they'd been planning this since 1936 to ultimately phase out the railway, because then we'll have to replace equipment and the whole bit, and then they put buses on. But of course, 1936 and 1938, even 1939, nobody knew about World War II yet, right? So they finally discontinued the streetcar service, and they put the buses on. But then all of a sudden, the capacity of the buses was nowhere near what the capacity of the streetcars were. And with the war effort and people, moving around between servicemen and the factory and stuff like that, it was just a nightmare. They really couldn't keep up, and you couldn't get buses. Right? So you bought what you thought you needed, and then the war happened, and you needed way more, and you couldn't get any because they were building, tanks and jeeps and other things for the war effort. So just wasn't a great situation when they did do the cutover. This is what the street system looked like in 1929. So like beyond Terrace Hill, the city in Grandview, and that was really, it was first of all, Grandview was in the township, and it was starting to develop, right? If you look at the schools and the churches there, all 1922, 1923. So early part of the 20th century started to be developed, and it really gained a lot more momentum as we got into the 1930s. But it was, when you look at what Brantford was, it was pretty extensive. Eagle Place, this wasn't all that much developed down here, and as you got out into Echo Place and that, it wasn't heavily populated. So it really had the town covered quite well. It got you to the blind school, it got you to the train station, it got you downtown. Over time, though, so this is routes kept changing. They would add lines, they would take lines out, they would dig stuff up. So just sort of at its height, this is what the system looked like. A couple streetcars in Brantford. This is what you would have seen before they ended. The Brantford Municipal Railway, the first bus lines in 1886 were in West Brant. Roughly Gilkinson and Cobra Street West, that's roughly where it was. Okay, that building lasted until 1937 because the city taken over for the City Works Department, then they just demolished it when they didn't need it anymore. When the electric railway, that is the Fred Nichols from Toronto, bought the municipal railway, he put this building up, which is still there. Where Speedy Auto Buses on Clarence and Colburn. Go about halfway to Alfred Street, and on the west side of on the south side, you'll see that building there. They had the barns there, and that's where the offices were. That's where you buy your tickets. In 1906, they built the bus barns on Brant Ave, right near St. Paul Ave. Many of you probably remember this building here. So it was built to store rail cars, and then they converted it to bus storage, and they used it till 1969. And there's an apartment building there now. That's the 4 or 5 story apartment building is on the site. The Grand Valley Railway was part of an interurban line. So unlike the Brantford Municipal, which is serviced Brantford, the Grand Valley was going to go, but went from Brantford to Galt through Paris. And it was the Von Ecke company who developed that line. They had the street railway, so as part of their whole interurban push, let's get people moving around town, and once you got you moving around town, let's get you to Hamilton or Galt or wherever you want to be. So they started the Grand Valley Railway. Really poorly built railway. It was just awful. It would run off the rails all the time, poorly ballasted lines. It wasn't a great railway. But it ran. Interesting, okay, so the Grand Valley opens between Brantford and Paris, all right? So you live in Paris, and you're a guy, and all the girls are Paris or yours, right? Now you got these guys coming from Brantford. Right? Because for 10 cents they can get to Paris, and they can start mining in Paris as opposed to just Brantford. So, you know, it created problems, and there was fights. But what it allowed people in Paris to do is it did get them, that they did have a few parks that you can see where they developed along the line to, you know, get you out of the city. This house still exists. This was the Grand Valley Railway Station. There was two stations. They built one when the line first opened in '03, and then they built this one in 1919. It's a duplex now, but you can see the bay window. And it was moved. It was on the corner of Willow and William Street, and it's moved further up the road. But you can go by, and it's still there today. The Brantford-Hamilton Electric Railway was also a Vineca railway, and that would get you to Hamilton. This railway was a really cool railway simply because it was built to a very, very high standard. And it was very sad when they discontinued service and they took this one down. This one offered hourly express service, parcel express, freight express between Brantford and Hamilton. It was a fairly, you know, in its early days, you know, it was fairly busy. The line was built, you know, really, really well. But the traffic and most interurban lines and even like with the THUB peaked in the 1920s. You know, around 1921, 22, 23, that's when the peak was, and then the automobile took over, the roads got better, and, you know, service dropped off drastically. And the saddest thing is not only to close the rail line down, but then they ripped up the line, so it's, you know, you had a really good line, you had a really, really well built line, it's gone. You just kind of did, Glenwood Drive, I think it's Glenwood Drive, it's the one, it goes behind, you know, Brantford Surplus, you know, the old Calbex Plaza. That road wasn't a road, that was the Brantford Hamilton Railway line. Okay, and then the city took it over in 1940, and they built the road up there. So it went along there, and then, you know, basically south of Highway 2, you know, for the most part. They had a power station on Murray Street up until about 10 years ago, Brantford took it over for a works department for like electrical things and that, but then they finally tore it down. And Langford, this is the Langford station. It's actually a manufacturing facility now. It's Cravo Equipment now, but what they did when they started the company is they took over the old substation, the old power substation. It's on White Swan Road. It's unfortunate that as the company got bigger and better, they tore it down because it wasn't a good building to use, and so it no longer exists. But they had a picture of it in their office, so I managed to get a picture of it. So you had a substation in Langford, and you had the one in Brantford, and you had one in Hamilton that provided power to the line. But they were developing enough power in the two ends, they didn't need the station anymore, so they closed it down. The Lake Erie Northern Railway, and that was really to get from Galt to Port Dover. That's what that was all about. That was an electric railway also. Again, it was just the businessmen, the industry people thought like the more rail the better, like the more the merrier, you get better rates, you get better service, the whole bit. You know, they built this line. This was a very popular line for people in Brantford because you go down to Port Dover, and, you know, to the beach and to the arbor and to the Erie Beach and all that. What happened was that this rail line connected with one that went to Kitchener, and as the rail traffic started to drop off, and it dropped off dramatically, they wanted to abandon the line in the 1950s, and the government, the Railway Commission said, no, you can't abandon the line. And he said, fine, we won't. We'll just make connecting between the various parts of the line miserable, and so they basically disconnected the service. So if you wanted to go from Port Dover to Galt, and you got to Brantford, you could wait a couple hours before you got the next train. That's just how they drove traffic away, because they just didn't want to do it anymore. What's interesting about this one, this is the Mount Pleasant station that the Brant Railway Heritage Society is rebuilding, is doing it. And this is taken from the L.E.N. station looking across to the, that's what I thought would be interesting. I had a better picture, but I thought this is the old Valley and N line right here. Sorry, T&B line. Because this is an L and N station. This is the T&B line here.
So is the building there?
No.
No, it's on,
So they moved it to, a farmer bought it and did some work initially and then used it for storage and then just got, just let it deteriorate. It's in really, really awful shape. So they basically stripped it down and they're rebuilding it and they're salvaging anything they possibly can and they're getting some lumber built by the mill from Mennonites because they don't make that size of lumber anymore. And then the county has agreed to help them with some, move it back, close to where it used to be. So all these circles were all train stations in Brantford. So the Buffalo, Brantford, Goderich Railway, and then the Buffalo and Lake Huron, and then the Grand Trunk. So there's 4 stations over time, all in here. What you had here is the Lake Erie Northern Station.
The Union Station,
Right. And then they had the Lake Erie Northern had the yards here, and they had their freight offices here. This was the original Great Western Railway station. This is here, sorry, this is the Brantford Waterloo Lake Erie line that ultimately became the T&B line. So when the Brantford people were building it, they didn't have a lot of money, they stopped in the West Brant side. It wasn't great because you still had to, there was nothing over here from an industrial point of view. You still had to get across the river. You had to build a bridge. And by trying to build the bridge is when they finally went out of business, they lost their money. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford it. It got taken over by a fellow by the name of Young out of Chicago, and he did his very best to finish off the bridge and get it to Hamilton. And he was like a few days late, and Brantford said, "No, you're late. Too bad, no bonus." It was like $70,000, and then the T&B took it over. So then the station got moved here, and this was the port, the Brantford, Norfolk, and Port Burwell Railway, and the same thing, except they had the station on the West Brant side before they could afford to put a bridge over. And the only way they could ultimately afford to put the bridge over is the Great Western Railway invested some money into the rail line to help them build the bridge, and then bought it out, took it over, and that way they got the line down to Tillsonburg. That was the last train of the T&B line.
Nice job.
Yeah, thank you.